I'll start this way. The squares were faded. The asphalt continued to hold the morning frost. Were it not for the girl jumping square to square, the playground frost would feel gray and worn. Instead, the winter warmed and the hopscotch was alive. They say hopscotch may have begun in 1200 BCE, India. They, whoever they are, you've heard me say that before. Also, that it was used to improve the footwork of armored Roman soldiers. Whatever the case, when she hopped out of the square, she ran to her mother, and we began the Martin Luther Day March at that time. I met Lisa in 2017. Winter Talk in Fort Worth.
Yes.
Since then, we've talked history of historical events and how those events influence our lives today. Lisa reminds us that painted hopscotch squares of history are always faded, always permeable, no matter how bright the new paint is. Lisa is a storyteller of what was and is and what might be. The question lingers on how well remembered history is. That old adage, if history is not known, it is bound to be repeated, fades quickly when you understand where Lisa goes, that it's not about forgetting history. It's about how well those other folks remember it. And when we don't know it, then things like Andrew Jackson ignoring the Supreme Court, it's easy today to go, I can be president and I can ignore a Supreme Court. When we forget about events in the 1862 concentration camp of Fort Snelling, we understand why it's used today. But when we don't remember this, of course it'll be repeated because they will repeat it. It's not about us remembering it and us not repeating it ourselves. It's about the folks in power, those who hold prestige, those who benefit profit-wise. Lisa makes us aware of those faded lines, no matter how brightly painted they are. Lisa comes with an easy smile, a light laugh, and brings us a historical truth to the Doctrine of Discovery. As you read Lisa's latest book on the Native American Church, you find our church and secular history is lacking indigenous voice, voices of color, othered voices, plant voices, animal voices, place voices. You will find, as an indigenous person, Lisa is a person of the dirt, of water, and the wind of her place. And you will listen, and when you listen carefully, you will begin to have the tools to become the dirt and water and wind of your place. I'm honored to introduce Lisa Barnett.
No pressure, no pressure. Dave, I'm glad that you reminded me that it was 2017 because I knew it was the winter talk at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, but I was no longer a Brite student. I didn't know if it was during my second master's degree, but it was the tail end of my PhD, and I was able to come because I was on a fellowship that year. I'd gotten funding from the department so that I didn't have to work and I didn't have to teach. And it was a couple from South Hills Christian Church that heard that that event was coming and that I was still technically in grad school and on a limited income. And they paid my registration fee for me so that I could attend. And that was my first, surprisingly, that was my first time to encounter the doctrine of discovery. Even though I had a master's degree in church history classes with Tim Lee, and I love Dr. Lee, but I never learned about these papal bulls. I learned all the popes. I had to memorize those for a test, right? In order and you know, but I didn't get to read those primary source documents, which is why more and more as I learned about it, now a professor in my own right, I assign those primary source readings to students. In fact, we just covered this last week in class. And it's hard for a lot of students to hear, and they tell me, this is a rough week. This is not the way to start this class, right? And I'm like, well, you know. But one of the things I think that I have learned is that our embedded theologies frame the telling of history in order to create these embedded historical narratives within the culture. And there's a theological basis for a lot of that has to be dismantled. I mean, if we think about it, discovery is sort of a strange piece of American legal code, right? But it has a very complex history. It's a vitally important legal tool for Euro-American Christian colonization, particularly in North America. And so the doctrine of discovery, or the doctrine of Christian discovery, the Christian doctrine of discovery, if you will, emerged really in the 15th century during this age of exploration, using legal and theological language to basically justify thievery as righteous Christian acts, right? So this doctrine of discovery is the basis that the first Christian explorers who ventured away from Europe and landed on foreign soil, a new world to them, had the right, by this concept of discovery, to now suddenly claim ownership of the land for their own, and I put that in italics, Christian monarch, because many of the monarchs were only nominally Christian. But it's this civil legal doctrine then that suddenly announces itself equally as a theological doctrine and a theological justification. It's like when I do pulpit supply now, I have a pair of Converse sneakers that match each of my stoles for the liturgical calendar of the year, right? And so when I show up and I have these sneakers on and people kind of look at you, you know, as you're getting ready for the service, I say, oh, they're my liturgical sneakers because they match my stole. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you've used that word liturgical, so they must be legitimate, right? Right? So, exactly. So we justify these things. And it comes rooted out of some papal bulls, but the basic part of discovery, here's what discovery meant. You landed a boat, you planted a flag, and you claimed the land to be empty, that terra nullius concept. And then once you do all that, that land, if it's not under the sovereignty of any state, suddenly you get to claim it. And what also comes out of this in that terra nullius concept, I mean, that's an old Roman law, a Latin word meaning nobody's land. If we look at the history of Oklahoma, the Panhandle and the Cherokee Outlet, at one point were no man's land is how they were defined until the land runs, right, for white settlement. But that old phrase out of Roman law, that Latin term, no man's land. So it's actually used even in international law to describe territory not under the sovereignty of any state. But it seems to imply then, if it's no one's land, then the land is empty. It is void of any people, of any civilization, of any culture. And that is the phrase then that starts to get applied to indigenous peoples' lands, whom the colonizers deemed not having a state, structure, or proper ownership. And this idea of ownership really influences our own civil law. if you look at the congressional debates during the 1830 Indian Removal Act, it's all about, well, they might have this land, but they're not using the land properly, meaning they're not using it the way we white settlers would use it, right? They don't have fences. They don't have this. They don't, right? And so then it becomes check, check, check. We can just take it because it's not deemed to be up to the standards, right, that we deem necessary. I mean, we're seeing that now even in certain neighborhoods, right? Neighborhood gentrification, right? We'll come in and we'll take the neighborhood over because it's not being used in the right way. So this doctrine of Christian discovery is still with us when it comes to this idea of land. And this idea of empty land myth, we had this discussion too last week in class, because this idea of virgin wilderness, right? I mean, you think about this idea of an empty land, a virgin wilderness, and then this sort of male power structure coming in and taking it over. I mean, there's some gender misogyny dynamics at operation, even in that theological sort of thinking there. It is these papal bulls that justified the colonialism and the conquest. And so we have 1542, Pope Nicholas V issues the bull Dum Diversus. This one authorizes King Afonso V of Portugal to subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ. In fact, I think some of this, it's kind of highlighted. You are to subjugate, notice this term though, enemies of Christ. Now we just say enemy of the state, enemy of the government, right? We're going to, with the help of God, we're going to stop the endeavors of the faithless, fortify with divine spread our faith, for which Christ our God shed his blood. We grant to you full and free power, and that's what I have underlined, through the apostolic authority by this edict, to invade, conquer, fight, subjugate the Saracens, who at that time, by the 16th century, those were the Muslims, the pagans, and other infidels. Change that word infidel to immigrant today, right? It's the word choice. When you create now these categories of others, whether it's based on religion or no religion or any other category that you want to create, this papal bull says you have the right then to reduce these persons to perpetual servitude, to take their belongings, including their land, to convert them to you and your use and your successors, i.e. to the kings of Portugal. Then in 1455-56, Pope Nicholas V issued the Romanus Pontifex, which extends now even more Portugal's authority to conquer those lands of the infidels and pagans for the salvation of all. This, folks, is the document specifically that granted Portugal the right to conquest in West Africa, to trade with the Saracens and infidels in those designated areas. Here's the actual papal bull issued by him. But it is this papal bull here, right, to vanquish and subdue Muslims, pagans, enemies of Christ, to take their kingdoms, to reduce persons to perpetual slavery. Now, if the Pope has extended Portugal's reign to West Africa to encounter Muslims and infidels and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Now, folks, we are justifying the start of the Atlantic slave trade. So the islands, and then that's going to be divided up. Once then Columbus, right, comes ashore there in the Bahamas in 1492 and starts reporting of the missions. Now notice just the images. Notice those crosses, right? You got the flags and the planting of the flags, but there's always a cross. Religion and empire go hand in this age of exploration. Even more recent paintings, right? The priest. There was always a priest that accompanied these missions as the spiritual guide advisor, right, to save souls. So with this increased exploration, Pope Alexander then in 1493, after Columbus, issues some bulls of donation, basically dividing the world into two hemispheres along a north-south line. Spain is going to get the west of that line, what becomes the Americas. Portugal gets the east, right? Africa and other continents, Australia and stuff like that. And therein, the world now is divided. And it's that famous bull from Alexander on May 4th, 1493, the Inter Caetera papal bull, where the Pope is desiring that barbarous nations, again, the rhetoric, barbarous nations be overthrown or subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the honor of God and the spread of the Christian empire. And it's through that Inter Caetera bull then that Pope Alexander VI provides Spain now with this legal justification to conquer all non-Christian indigenous nations. And thus begins the age of Christian doctrine of discovery. Oh, there's the Inter Caetera, that papal bull. Oh, and here's part of it, yeah. That the Catholic faith, right, be increased, that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. It reminds me of a book that I use in one of my classes by Catherine Jen Lum, talking about American history in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, called Heathen. Right? It's all about the words. When you create a category of barbarous nations, of heathens, of infidels, again, then you create somehow this justification that it's okay to oppress them, to abuse, to take, to steal, etc., etc. And of course, 21 years after the writing of Inter Caetera, then you have the Spanish jurist Palacios Rubio, who writes the infamous Requiramiento, right, the requirement, which provides the Spanish legal authority to wage a just war. So now we're moving this criteria for just war theory. And Spanish conquistadors would find a new land to them, and the priest who sailed with them would stand at the edge of a village and read the Requiramiento, which describes what would happen to you. Well, if you accept, we will receive you in love and charity and shall leave you and your wives and your children and your lands free without servitude. But, says the priest, if you resist, I don't know, oh, Billy's getting messages on here. I'm sorry, they're talking to us. He's getting emails. If you resist, says the priest, we will, with the help of God, powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. Notice the church now rules over the secular. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them. And they're reciting the Requiramiento in either Latin or Spanish, which when you first land and you plant the flag, no one is understanding. And so native peoples are not able to understand, and that then is the justification to go in. Well, we warned you. We gave that little speech, right? We told you what would be happening. And again, it's Catholic priests who are used at that tulip from the Minnesota, for you Minnesotans, right? The Father Hennepin there and the Discovery. Now, lest we go and say, oh, that Roman Catholic Church, shame on them. No, no, no. It's the same legal principle used by every Protestant Christian group who also made claims to native land in North America. By the time the Church of England even gets established there at Jamestown in 1607, the doctrine is so established that the colonists, 105 of them, presumed that the King of England had granted them an every right to all of that territory that they found there in Virginia. You don't often see it, but it is the Puritan patent charter from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The principal end of this plantation is to win and incite the natives of the country to the knowledge and obedience of the only true God and Savior of mankind and the Christian faith. I mean, that's part of the charter for the land coming out of New England. So it's often argued that the doctrine of discovery is one of the markers of the beginnings now of international law. Of course, let's note, historically, international law at that time is European law, right? Okay, let's look at it through that lens. And its function is to, even though it's explicitly Christian, it's adjudicating Christian countries from others to know where some of the boundary lines are. In fact, by the 1750s, it's interesting, a young George Washington was functioning on the basis of a very clear understanding of the doctrine of discovery as a surveyor, right? Taking care to nail down the best of those Native American lands in the Ohio Valley as personal investments and for the Washington family land business. And that was still Indian country inhabited by the Senecas and numerous other communities in the Ohio League there. And it took an all-out war of destruction that was declared by Washington as commander of the Continental Army and under his presidency to finally wrest land away from those tribes in the 1760s and 1770s. And so we get this entry of the Christian doctrine of discovery into North American jurisprudence. Now, one of the things when I was doing my grad work at Texas Christian University, I got to teach an undergrad class called Multicultural U.S. History. I don't know if it can still be taught today in Texas, at universities, to be real honest, right? But one of the things that I always, that I did in preparing for that class is to kind of look at history in different lenses. And I think that's what learning more about the Christian doctrine of discovery has taught me as a historian is what's missing in the history, right? Whose voices are not present, and how do we read history sometimes against the grain? And I am indebted, I know the book study group did Ned Blackhawk's The Rediscovery of America. I am so indebted to Dr. Blackhawk for helping me to also unpack American history from an indigenous perspective, right? And it just, I mean, it's mind-blowing with that. And there's some other works out there that I'll talk about here in a little bit. But so one of the things with this class is the teaching of the American Revolution. And so part of that teaching of the American Revolution, the Boston Massacre, this chaotic melee on March 5th, 1770, that left 5 Bostonians dead, offer a glimpse into some of that blurred lines between reality and propaganda. For instance, in 1770, you saw Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. It was put together 3 weeks after the event. Revere copied most of his famous image from that of another engraver, Henry Pelham. And the engraving distorts the scene a little bit by showing the Boston crowds as kind of innocent and defenseless, while the British soldiers there are depicted right as the deliberate murderers and stuff like that. But what's really interesting is who they're firing at, and you see some of the colors because it was discovered after that the first man typically shot in this massacre was part African and part indigenous. His name was Crispus Attucks. I don't see Crispus in that image from Paul Revere, right? It's not until 80 years later, in 1856, from some of the Northern abolitionists that have learned who that person was, that suddenly you get the color in the image. And so that's part of how this, well, if we call them infidels, if we call them a heathen, if we call them a pagan, other, right? We can just wipe them out from history. You know, 1792, Secretary of State, then Secretary of State, not long after U.S. independence, Thomas Jefferson actually claimed the doctrine of discovery developed by these European states as international law that is now applicable to this new United States. And he exercises that doctrine of discovery when he becomes president in 1803 with this Louisiana Purchase. Now, you know, a lot of people frame history, oh, that was the greatest land deal ever, right? Because it expands who we are as a country. But to ensure U.S. possession of that entire territory, he then proceeds to send the Corps of Discovery, the military unit called the Corps of Discovery, led by Lewis and Clark and guided by Sacagawea, who saved their butt on many occasions, right, out there. But what they are doing on this journey throughout the American West, they're enacting these legal rituals of discovery, right? It's all about taking the territory. And so even one of the things that I find interesting, Meriwether Lewis wrote a 2,500 word speech that was recited to each native nation that they encountered in English. It's the Spanish El Requiramiento being adopted now on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And the speech would explain to the native peoples they encountered the new discovery-based political structure of American sovereignty, and native leaders were given gifts, medals, and American flags, marking those people now as part of the American territory. Now you belong to us because we've given you this flag, right? Planting of the flag, and we've given you this medal. But at the same time, Lewis was also very careful in that speech to delineate this new relationship of parent and child to the native communities that they encountered. From this time on, the President of the United States, again in English, is known as the Great Father. Indians were to be the children, meaning they were to be obedient, right, to the Great Father. And yet, a lot of historians talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition really do sort of romanticize it, right? It becomes the basis then for this manifest destiny westward expansion, when really it's a tragic narrative that describes how a lot of indigenous peoples lost their lands. Again, some of those same rituals that they're performing come out of the papal bulls and the practices there. And then, of course, it's 1823 in the Johnson v. McIntosh decision, a very early landmark Supreme Court case that reifies the discovery in American civil law. John Marshall is the one who's going to write this opinion, but the case decided ownership between two American claims to a large parcel of property in modern southern Indiana that was Piankashaw territory. And the overriding question here is how, John Marshall is the one who's going to create that language that forms our modern day doctrine of discovery. But the question between these two claimants that Marshall is writing the unanimous opinion for is, how could these settlers purchase it from Native American tribes? The Johnson Partnership said they had legal title to the land because they purchased it from the Piankashaw tribe nation just prior to the American Revolutionary War. The court said, wait. By buying it directly from the native peoples, you circumvented the colonial government of the day, the English, who really owned the land. Didn't matter if you paid the native peoples. It was the English government that ultimately, and that then becomes the dominion of the government owns the land, and native peoples just have occupancy rights. They don't own it. And Marshall extends the reason that they don't own it is because they inhabit this country as fierce savages. And to leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. They are just occupants to be protected, who are in possession of their lands, but they are deemed incapable of transferring the absolute title to others. And thus, Marshall now gives the support to the Europeans who justified this right of discovery. Oh, I think, yeah, this next slide. The right of discovery, this is from Marshall, is confined to the countries then unknown. And here's the Christian language that gets into American law. Confined to countries then unknown to all Christian people, notwithstanding the occupancy of the natives who were heathens, right? That's when this word starts to crop up. And at the same time, admitting the prior title of any Christian people who have made a previous discovery. Folks, it's out of this Supreme Court case that is still the foundation of property law in this country that suddenly we are now identifying ourselves as a Christian nation. We hadn't before. But now Marshall identifies this doctrine of discovery based on the Christian identity of the colonizer. And it implies that the Christianity of Euro-Americans is superior, and thus then begins this link to we're a Christian nation. And that is what still haunts us today, right? In terms of that. Yeah, I won't go into that. But Johnson is still the law, like I said, in the United States today. It has also influenced the jurisprudence and the histories of other settler colonial countries. I'm thinking particularly New Zealand, Australia, and even Canada. So, yeah. And it's out of that 1823 Supreme Court decision and a lot of that doctrine of discovery that gets turned into American civil law. Boy, Billy's getting a lot of emails today. At least on my end. I don't know if they don't show up on here. Okay, they're showing up here on mine. But this is what, Andrew Jackson uses to justify the removal of the 5 Southeast tribes as the start, I'll say the start, with that 1832 Indian, I think I typed that wrong. It should be 1830, I think, Indian Removal Act. It is 1830. I made a typo there. Pardon me. Because here, there it is, 1830. To provide for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the river Mississippi to a land dubbed Indian Territory where they can reside in perpetuity free from the incursion of whites. Well, how long did that last? Yeah, how'd that work for you, right? How's that working for you? Resulting, of course, in the trails of tears. And there were many. And the image of this one, the dark clouds, really, I think, captures a lot more of some of the mood from that. But you have the relocations of the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, and the Choctaw at various times. This is where the Supreme Court decision, the Worcester case, is decided, and Jackson's like, well, let Chief John Marshall enforce it. We're going to do our own thing. You know whose presidential portrait during the first Trump administration graced the Oval Office? I don't know if it's still there, if it's been replaced with some gold leaf, right, around it. That there's a reason why some people admire Andrew Jackson. So originally, the 5 Southeast tribes had some land. Now, this is kind of from 1854, where they're sharing there with the Quapaw Seneca. I'm thinking the Shawnee and the Delaware are also up in that corner as well. The Republic of Texas takes their part right there. But notice all of the land, right, that's there. That's going to be changing real quick after that, because that is not what Oklahoma looks like today. It's a much more patchwork of native nations that are present within the now state of Oklahoma. And it wasn't just the 5 Southeast tribes. You had tribes from the northern plains coming down, even into Nebraska, to Kansas, with the Potawatomi, with the Ho-Chunks, with the Oto, Missouri, Sac and Fox. I mean, it's the native population is all being pushed into what becomes Indian territory. And in fact, the Historical Society there are waves of removal from 1830 to 1862. This is the tribal nations removed or assigned reservations into Oklahoma. That's how many tribes from that time period, 1830 to 1862. It continues from 1867 to 1892. Now there's some more tribes that are assigned lands in what is now the state of Oklahoma. And many from, right next to each other here. So this displacement of land. 1835, you may not be familiar. I just learned about it here in the last few years. There's a Tennessee State Supreme Court case, State v. Foreman, where the state jurisdiction relied on the doctrine of discovery to prioritize white property rights and state sovereignty over indigenous sovereignty. So now, even more so, codified into our law is a racialized white supremacy. The principle declared in the 15th century, this is part of that court case, as the law of Christendom, that discovery gave title to assume sovereignty over and to govern the unconverted natives of Africa, Asia, and North and South America, has been recognized as part of the national law for nearly 4 centuries. Folks, here's states' rights in action. Right? State rights have already said, doctrine of discovery, we get to claim simply because we're white and of European descent, and therefore Christian and superior. So now the U.S. has built an empire, and now we have to keep that empire, and we use the doctrine of discovery to do so. We've kind of superimposed here this painting of John Gast in 1872 called American Progress. It's often kind of used with Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion, right? education and freedom, moving, chasing indigenous peoples out of the painting. And you put that with the Bible verse. And what do you get? Dominion theology, right? That's the Christian theology. So manifest destiny was really kind of the continuation. And I say manifest destiny as it's typically applied and typically thought of as the continuation of the doctrine of discovery that adapts to the 19th century. I'm trying to wrestle with another new historical work by Andrew Eisenberg out of the University of Kansas, talking about the age of the borderlands, Indian slaves, and the limits of manifest destiny from 1790 to 1850, where he talks about manifest destiny was a political phrase that got picked up by a partisan political newspaper writer, John O'Sullivan. And it was kind of thrown around, and he was laughed at the time for using the phrase because, as Eisenberg notes, the U.S. was in competition with a lot of native empires in this time period who were much stronger than the U.S. American government. Manifest destiny really gets picked up as a political slogan of American exceptionalism in the early part of the 20th century, kind of that heyday revival of the lost cause of the Civil War that comes out kind of after Reconstruction and continues into the early part of the 20th century. But we still use it to talk about the significant transformation and the taking of land. Oh, there's John O'Sullivan's the term. But it does kind of capture, though, this idea coming out of the Crusades and these papal sanctioned sort of processes of holy wars and chosen people and terra nullius and converting heathens and things like that. But it's this idea that comes to us that somehow God has given this country a mission to expand territory throughout all of North America. And it continues into 1862. The Homestead Act continues this long appropriation, if you will, of indigenous land and the distribution to white Christian settlers. Because most of the lands that are given are to whites. Now, there were some exodusters, coming after the Civil War that got lands in Kansas and some of the all-black towns that cropped up in Oklahoma. But a lot of the lands were going to white settlers. Because this also, shortly after the Homestead Act, coincides with the Dawes Act, where you take an allotment, you cut your connection to your tribal culture, right? And we'll leave you alone, and you get to, improve it. You can't own it, though, for 25 years until you can prove to the federal government that you can successfully be a farmer or a rancher, and you can make those home improvements and stuff like that. But look at 1911, estimated that 350,000 acres are going to be offered for sale for white settlement. Takes land to maintain an American empire. And we don't stop with just the continental United States. 1867, for $7.2 million, we negotiate to purchase what becomes Alaska from Russia. Initially marked, as Seward's Folly. It's all about resource and resource extraction. Gold, oil, and timber. And the strategic importance as America's gateway to the Pacific and to the Arctic there. Russia, of course, at that time faced financial strain. They had defense concerns, so they were more than happy to sell the territory there in 1867. But they sold it, and there were indigenous peoples on the land, right? They had inhabited that land for thousands of years. but their claims were initially regarded as, well, your land's just public domain, right? So we can't. Now there's a treaty that classifies, now we get these categories. Well, some groups are civilized and they get a path to citizenship. Others are uncivilized according to federal law and they get nothing. So the impact is little attention is paid to native claims. Now, I will say in 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act eventually does grant 44 million acres and nearly $1 billion to native corporations, addressing some of the issues from that 1867 transfer, but certainly it is not nearly enough. Because adding Alaska to our land base, that's more land. And if you think about this Western capitalist mindset, more is better, right? More acres for us as a country obviously is better. And we don't just stop there. By the end of the 19th century, most white Christians in the U.S., again, had that very kind of common belief that we have a mandate from God to spread Christianity, not just here on native lands, but all over the world, because we are so great. And so after the defeat of Spain, in that little skirmish there, Spanish-American War, the U.S. invades Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and claimed them as colonies under then this worldview of still kind of justifying out of that Christian doctrine of discovery. And then throughout the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century, we have to negotiate. Of course, we know Puerto Rico is still a U.S. territory. No citizenship status, but but that very paternalistic, great father kind of analogy that comes from early American history. And I may have copied that slide again. So anyway, Hawaii is another example. I do a whole unit, a whole lecture on Hawaii with my classes on colonial mission work. And I just put a few of these slides up. I'm kind of wanting to get to time, but I'm going to highlight a few things here. 1825, missionary boarding schools are established in Hawaii. Wow, that's even before our boarding schools, right? So missionaries are already there, the first to introduce Western-style formal schooling targeting adults and then later children through the Hawaiian language. And it's an early American missionary there, female seminaries, their own separate schools. And so between 1824 and 1827, nearly the whole adult population is attending these sort of mission station schools. Now, the leaders of Hawaii get converted to Christianity. And by 1830, Christianity is enforced and cultural practices get banned. Right? We've heard that story among Native peoples here in Americas. Queen Kahumanu, wife of Kamehameha I, right, and regent after his death, adopts Christianity and forces it on the kingdom, banning the Hawaiian religious practices and forbidding public performances of the hula, which was a religious practice. But much like some of the powwows and stuff today, it now becomes this way to continue the practice without, getting punished for the ban. By 1839, missionaries established the first English-only school in Hawaii, the Royal School, and the strategy is now to educate the elite Native Hawaiian monarchy and elite classes, because once you get the leaders converted to Christianity, then the rest will follow. King Kamehameha III allows foreigners now to own land. And this was probably the tragic mistake, right? Dividing up the land, the Mahali policy, and we get the sugar plantations and the massive land dispossession, transferring of lands from families and communities with this land division and fees and land titles. And Native Hawaiians who are not familiar with this system of doing business failed to make some of the claims and then are just dispossessed of those family lands. By 1888, 3/4 of all arable land in Hawaii is controlled by non-native Hawaiian settlers. David Kaluakawa becomes king and wants to reduce the power of the white missionary party that's become its own political party for reform, trying to get Hawaii to become a territory of the United States. So then there's this little skirmish. There's the plantation owners force the king to sign this bayonet constitution. The people revolt because they're like, wait, that's not in our best interest. And the landowners, are kind of putting themselves against seizing the Hawaiian islands. And finally, the president has to get involved. 1898, the U.S. annexes Hawaii and seizes the lands, and we get this ethnocidal campaign now launched to outlaw traditional healing practices, forbidding the healers, all the religious ceremonies. And if traditional healing practices are engaged, you've got fines and imprisonments. It's just like what has been happening too on Native American lands. And the kahunas were forbidden to practice until 1973 in Hawaii. That's a long time. Native Hawaiians oppose U.S. illegal annexation. Nearly half sign a petition to Congress. Liliuokalani, the former queen who's deposed by the military, travels to plead her case. Congress passes the Hawaiian Organic Act, and President McKinley signs it into law. Thereafter, to protect Hawaii as a territory. But then 2 years after that, the Organic Act ensures the dominance of the English language in the new territory, that all government business must be conducted in English only, and the very act of speaking Hawaiian is forbidden and punished. And we know it became a state. There's a great book, Hawaiian by Birth. It's 12 companies of American missionaries that are sent to the Hawaiian Islands between 1819 and 1848 with the goal of spreading American Christianity, New England values. By the 1850s, American missionary families in the islands had birthed more than 250 white children who now claimed to be Native Hawaiians to replace the indigenous culture in Hawaii. And these are the children of white missionaries who are going to eventually alienate themselves from the Hawaiian monarchy. Most of them chose not to follow in their parents' footsteps, to serve the church. Most rejected the Christian faith and went into business with some of the plantation owners. And all supported the annexation of Hawaii, despite their parents' hopes that the islands would remain independent. And of course, we know the loss of culture, the indigenous culture in Hawaii that is now working to try to be reclaimed today out of respect for sovereignty. So let's talk about the Christian doctrine of today and how it impacts us. It continues to influence land appropriation, cited in court cases like the 2005 decision, City of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. The Supreme Court held that the Oneida Indian Nation could not restore tribal sovereignty to land that had been taken by New York State. In that decision, the court draws heavily upon the Christian Doctrine of Discovery in its opinion, saying the Oneidas had relinquished governmental reins and could not regain them through open market purchases from current title holders. Okay. So what are the other doctrine effects in our world? Well, we still have this subhuman status. that the doctrine historically relegated indigenous populations to a subhuman status, which is then used to justify forced conversion, enslavement, the removal of children to boarding schools. You have this ideological legacy. It's the foundation of this modern dominion theology movement, where Christian nationalist ideologies are used to justify the continued subjugation of indigenous and non-Christian peoples. Oh my gosh, just a few weeks ago, Muslims in Broken Arrow, which is a suburb here, have bought land years ago hoping to build their own mosque in Broken Arrow. And they have finally saved and they have raised money to do so. And they went before the city council to get zoning permission to start building. And all the white people in Broken Arrow showed up. We don't want Sharia law in our backyard. And so the city council said, well, the building of a mosque would increase traffic. Never mind all the new businesses and restaurants that are opening in Broken Arrow, right, that are increasing traffic, but no. So this idea that we can subjugate, and the persistent inequity remains a key factor then when it comes to sovereignty, to treaty rights, to land repatriation. And I think even this expansive meaning of discovery, this colonizing of the other through this gaze, right? And I think this is what some people were I can't remember who we were talking, but this idea, Phil Deloria says it so well, Plain Indian in his book, that Americans they wanted to erase that culture, but there were some parts of the culture that supported, right, the performativity of what it meant to be a good American. And so we'll dress like native peoples and dump tea in the harbor in Boston to declare our independence. But then we'll subjugate those peoples, those real peoples, later on, right? And so there's this, we get this, I think, today, this kind of, well, it doesn't really belong to you. This sort of sense of entitlement, of arrogance, even of righteousness in this common use of this word discovery, right? Oh, I've discovered these people's rituals, or oh, I've discovered this sacred site, or these sacred texts, or this music and the art. And then somehow some people feel that they can then start to possess those, right? And that's why you have this pretend Indians, right? A white person who goes to a sweat lodge and then all of a sudden decides to profit off of that by leading this indigenous ritual, right? Because they've discovered it for themselves and it meant so much. And so now I can commodify it and share it with everyone else. But that also kind of leads into a contemporary doctrine of discovery with like gentrification, right? Moving into neighborhoods and things like that. Now, the Vatican did refute the doctrine of discovery. They did say in 2023, they did, but the statement denied that it was a teaching of the Catholic Church. So their apology says, well, those documents had been manipulated for political purposes by colonial empires. The Vatican, though, does acknowledge the importance of indigenous voices in addressing the doctrine of discovery, but, do I have a, no, I don't. It stops short of rescinding those papal bulls, Dum Diversas, Romanus Pontifex, and Inter Caetera, on which the doctrine is based. So how much of a repudiation if you don't deal with the legal documents at the time? And folks, I'm sorry, but in 2025, an Indian nation out of the San Manuel Nation that reclaimed their ancestral name and put a billboard up only to have it vandalized by saying America is not on stolen land, your ancestors were conquered. And we see the doctrine of discovery today. I'm sorry, but we got to go here.
Oh, yeah.
With the takeover of Venezuela, that U.S. will run Venezuela and American oil companies will invest. Yeah, right, that didn't happen. But wants Venezuelans to sell oil to the U.S. at market price. Notice that doesn't benefit the Venezuelan people. It benefits U.S. consumers, right? But this idea of resources that are there that we can take, right? U.S. colonists get out. Oh, and then he turns himself to Greenland. That 19th century on, the U.S. has kind of expanded territory, and now this further interest with these stupid memes. This is just further policy, though. I mean, this is a throwback to those days of gunboat diplomacy, right? Notice, what do? We plant the flag. What did all of those early explorers do? We plant a flag and we claim it as our own, and we use the flag as the symbol. This is the Christian doctrine of discovery here in action today. Planting the flag and claiming the rare earth minerals on the land. And as Lori had talked about, Oglala Sioux members that are held at Fort Snelling. Folks, Fort Snelling was a concentration camp by the U.S. during the Dakota Indian Wars that imprisoned thousands of Dakota and Ho-Chunk people in very abysmal conditions. Now, the building, the Bishop Henry Whipple building that's located there in Fort Snelling, has now been, kind of taken over by Department of Homeland Security's Immigration Enforcement Control. The physical fort was actually built in 1805 to stop the fighting between the Dakota and the Ojibwe people, but then it became a military fort used to steal Native people's lands. And the military fort that then arose in 1862 during the height of the Dakota Indian Wars, they constructed then this sort of concentration camp to house the Dakota Ho-Chunk people before they could ship them off to reservations in South Dakota and Nebraska. Or Texas, or wherever, right? Yeah. And you had famine, you had disease, you had malnutrition that killed approximately 300 Dakota prisoners, a majority of whom were women and children. The building, the Whipple building, was a federal administrative building there at Fort Snell. It was named after Bishop Henry Whipple, a vocal opponent of the Dakota removal and genocide and a religious leader during the 1800s. And so, yes, the trauma inflicted upon indigenous communities in that area, housing some of all my relatives, right? Just yesterday, we're on Osage land. And just yesterday, the chief standing bearer of the principal chief of the Osage addressed Immigration and Customs Enforcement, reminding their citizens to carry their identification. And if something were to happen, a violation of civil rights, here's what you do. But have your federal state photo ID and your Osage Nation membership and the numbers to call should something happen. Oh yeah, here's Hedgebeck's boost of that, approving the use of that military base. And as Lori indicated, AIM, which started in Minneapolis as a reaction to police brutality in the 1960s, right, is now showing up in force in Minneapolis to protect the community once again in 2026. This photo is actually from 2020 after the death of George Floyd, when AIM also came out in full force there to help the community. So, History is important to learn. It is important to teach. It is important to share. It is important to start looking again how contemporary events start to reflect history, and to think about how we can stop sometimes that cycle of history being repeated. Partly, we need to stop with the categories, right? And we need to open our mind to thinking about that too. I mean, you want to talk about a two-eyed approach to history. Dr. Blackhawk's book certainly does that. So some recommended reading there. That's all I got. I'm a little over, but we started a little late, so I'll chalk it up there.
I'm
gonna let you just shut everything down.
We'll take a few minutes for questions, as always. And thank you, Lisa. That
Thank
was great.
And I am happy to share this PowerPoint if you want a PDF. If Dave's got, I think Dave's got most of your emails. If you're not on that email list, make sure Dave gets it, and I'll just send it out to everyone. I'll do a PDF and send it to y'all.
I guess I'll start off with some of obviously history matters.
Yes.
Having those books written
Mm-hmm.
so it can be read matters. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on publishing now, especially within the Christian churches across the way? How well are we engaging in writing history today?
Academic scholars are doing a really good job. A lot of some church historians are doing a really good job. We disciples could be doing a better job, but part of it is the publishing. I'm sorry, but Chalice Press just won't publish history books anymore. They're going to publish more pastoral leadership, kind of stuff like that. I'm on the Historical Society trustee board, and we're getting ready to talk about maybe some more possibilities of publishing via the imprint of Chalice Press that the Historical Society has. Ed Robinson's book on Preston Taylor that came out, and I think Yvonne's that's under contract, is coming out of the Historical Society. So I think Joel really wants to try to do some more there. I'm actually under contract right now. Jamie Gorman, who's at Abilene Christian, they're putting together a book on the history of the church, the historiography of the churches of Christ, and I'm doing their chapter on Indigenous people, so I'm doing some early Stone Campbell stuff. But then I'll branch off after 1906 to focus on their stuff. But, part of my year sabbatical too, coming up, hopefully, will be also, besides my other research projects, to do some more with disciples' history. Because quite frankly, we have, with Yakima, we've got Muriel Watkins' book and some that Keith has done, but they're really dated. And they're really products of their historical time that need to have fresher eyes and more critical analysis done of what was taking place.
A question?
Can I do a follow-up to what you just
Yeah.
said? While you're talking, and I'm sorry that it's focused on disciples' history, but I'm thinking about when we came into being in 1832,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that where we're so proud that we had evangelists that would go into a town and start a church and then continue to go westward.
Right.
Set the
Yeah.
church up and go.
Uh-huh.
And then that's around the time of the land grab.
Yes, it is.
Right. So I'm just wondering, has there been any historical work done on our role at the Christian Church Disciples of Christ as being part of it and participating?
Yeah, I did that speech at the Kirkpatrick lecture where I talked about the Oklahoma territory. They had a state evangelist, E.F. Boggs, I think, who people from all over the country sent money to buy a horse, and he trained the horse to not, buck when the gunshots and stuff went off, and he had money from what is now Church Extension, right, to go in and to stake land claims to build churches, and Perry was one of the first places that he came to. Yeah.
I know that the DSAP board has frequently sort of new board orientation,
Uh-huh.
all that story.
Yeah, yes.
You know, the land grab and people are, when I first heard it, I was like, oh, I mean, they literally had teams of people. They
Yes.
funded teams of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Horses,
Yes,
grannies, like, shop the go,
Yeah.
let's go. And that's, you know, that's why we have such density in Oklahoma.
Yes, and it was a land agent, Dick Morgan,
Yeah.
who was also a disciple, who was really good about stamping those land grabs early on and approving them for the church. Because his grandson contacted me because his grandson was writing this very hagiographical biography that got published in the Chronicles of Oklahoma about his grandfather, who was an active participant in some of this land grab work in Oklahoma. So to say more history does need to be told and written.
And the churches need to know.
And
that.
the churches need to know that
Yes.
too, yes. And that's why, you know, every church needs to kind of go back and do their history in an honest sort of way. And that's part of the problem with human nature. We all want to be good. You know, our church wants to do good things, but sometimes we don't. And we have to acknowledge that. And the church has to also acknowledge that as much as we want to say, oh, those papal bulls, right? We use that same rhetoric. We picked up that same ideology as good Protestants and just brought it further and further into U.S. America. Yeah, Terry.
We have a strong relationship still with our disciples. Puerto Rico, there's about
Yes.
5 congregations.
Yes.
And the history of that, you know, it becomes U.S. territory. The mainline Protestant denominations literally divided up the island.
Yes.
And said, you take this piece, you take that piece. And so disciples, our little area
Yes.
around the little part of the island called Bayamon.
Mhm.
And our congregations are very concentrated sort of in that area. But that was, I didn't know that history explained between GMP. And I said,
Yes.
wait a minute. You came and you said, we'll just divide up the land. And
Right.
the Protestant churches basically took over and evangelized and set up churches in Puerto Rico. It's crazy.
And I didn't learn that in disciples history, but now that I have learned it, I teach it now when I teach disciples history. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of disciples history I teach that a lot of disciples today don't want to know. But it is important because, again, if we don't learn anything, we just keep doing the same dumb thing over and over and over again. And at some point, it's the good people that need to stand up and say, stop. Stop this madness. Yes.
Isn't RBG the one who wrote the majority opinion in that 2005?
Yes, and again, as much as we want to say, yeah, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Yes, she did write that. Again, she's basing it on the precedents of the law that, again, going back to 1823, that Johnson v. McIntosh decision. And so, yeah, she wrote it. And when I read that, I'm like, oh, Ruth, really? You know, but yeah.
But isn't that a part of the complexity?
It is.
Because we live in a time that especially liberal folks really don't want to blame anything. And the last thing I want to do is blame Ruth or Kristen Keller.
Yes.
Or LGBTQ. When the reality is, this is the education we all come up with. It gets embedded in all of us.
Yeah.
No matter where we are, where we're from. And so how do we get on the other side of that? Especially if we are about the rule of law and we just maintain the rule of law, how do you stand outside the rule of law and go, oh, well, especially as a judge, to say, well, no, I'm gonna let the rule of law go.
It's easy to default to the rule of law. And then when you get activist courts that want to change and push back on that, that's where the political divide and stuff. But I will say too, I am encouraged a lot by a younger generation of Indigenous activists, a younger generation of white activists that are out there who are basically saying social justice matters to us, and challenging and pushing. And because they're having to learn, you know, some of the history along the way. One of the things I've started doing, that program, Be the Neighbor for youth summer trips. There's one that comes to Tulsa. They stay at Harvard Avenue, and they do race reconciliation. They do a lot of the Greenwood area here in North Tulsa from the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, right? Which I didn't learn about growing up in Oklahoma. I didn't learn in college. It was much later, you know, that suppression of history sort of things. But they learn about that. But they invite me to come speak about the indigenous landscape of Oklahoma as this kind of microcosm. And for each of the groups that come in, I do a little bit of research about where they're coming from and the indigenous history in their place and some of the events. And then I put it together into that story. And they're just amazed at what they can learn from that. And they're really good students, high school students, you know, who come, and adults with them who listen and they learn. It's that learning kind of relationship. It's not about doing service or anything like that. It's about learning. So that's been encouraging for me to do that. And I incorporate all of this stuff, like I said, in my classes at Phillips, whether it's church history, history of religion and social justice, you know, things like that. Yeah, Pedro.
So what do you think would happen if, sort of get why the Pope, like Francis, didn't
Right.
eliminate the doctrine?
Mm-hmm.
What would happen to the legal system, at least the system of property law?
Yeah.
If he actually did away with the doctrine,
Wow.
because everything rests on the doctrine,
Yes.
doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I know. And that, I think that's why the church is hesitant to. It's that Western capitalist mindset system that has so gripped the law as well. Yeah. Sadly. Yeah. I mean, she sang that song last night, right? Because there's that take, you know, kind of stuff. Yeah, it's all about that producer consumer. But it's all about the extraction of resources from indigenous populations, whether they're in Hawaii or Alaska or the continental mainland or Greenland or Canada or, you know, Venezuela. It's a threat to all indigeneity in that broad sense.
Edwin, would you have that approach?
Well, I hope I'm giving you stuff to think about. Any online or anything?
Nothing.
Thank you all. Thank you all. I mean, I hope I'm giving you a lot to think about.